So, hello and welcome everyone to this webinar for Europe. It's actually the last one for the semester. And today we have Eleeza Agopian with us today. She went up really early to be here and present for us. So, thank you for that, Eleeza. She will tell us about some key insights from the registration data request service, whose 2-year pilot actually is ending now in November. And she will tell us about the next steps as well. I have in the chat room copied in the link where you can find her presentation already, and the recording will be up there within an hour after the end of this webinar. Eleeza has said she's happy to take questions throughout her presentation. So the way to ask questions is to either type them in the Q&A pod, as you can see at the bottom of your screen. Type them there, not in the chat room. Please try to avoid that, and I will read out the questions for you. Or you can also use the raise hand button. That's also at the bottom of your screen. And I will then unmute you so that you can ask your question directly yourself. And with that, that's all from me. So Eleeza, I'm handing over to you. Thank you for.
Thank you, Gabby. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to you, because I know it's afternoon in Europe. Good morning for me. I'm based in Los Angeles, but this is pretty typical for those of us on the West Coast of the United States who work for ICANN. So I'm happy to be here with you. As Gabby said, my name is Eleeza. I'm ICANN's Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. My team actually leads the Registration Data Request Service project, and I'm going to be walking you through the presentation today. So here's today's agenda. We're going to talk a bit about where we stand. As Gabby mentioned, the pilot is nearly concluded, but the board recently took action asking ICANN Org to continue operations of RDRS, and I'll talk about that a bit more a little bit later on. So we'll do a high-level overview of RDRS operations, including some statistics, engagement, and awareness highlights, some update on system enhancements, and also what some of the recommendations were from the RDRS Standing Committee, which we worked with and provided input on the pilot throughout. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the service itself. RDRS is a free 2-year pilot service. It launched in November of 2023, so we're just coming up, I think, in 2 days on the end of the official pilot service. We developed it with ICANN community input to provide a standardized format for handling requests for gTLD non-public registration data. The service itself was developed by ICANN and utilized existing ICANN materials, systems, and tools, including the naming service portal, which is our tool for communication with accredited registrars. Requesters can create an account or use their existing ICANN account to access RDRS. So if you've ever attended an ICANN meeting, you have an ICANN account, you could utilize that to access RDRS. And the data that we collected during this 2-year pilot is really what was needed to help inform the board's ultimate decision on the outstanding SSAD policy, consensus policy recommendations, the System for Standardized Access Disclosure, which the EPDP Phase 2 team developed several years ago. The GNSO Council had asked the ICANN Board to hold off on taking action on those recommendations to gather more input on what demand for and usage of a system might look like. And that was really the purpose of this pilot. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of the history of how we got to the launch. So as I mentioned, there were recommendations, policy recommendations that were developed for an SAD during the EPDP Phase 2. Phase 1, of course, was the work on the temporary specification for gTLD registration data. That was a specification that was launched in response to the GDPR and focused in on the requirements for registration data that needed to be collected. Phase 2 was really focused on requirements for a system for requesting access to or disclosure of redacted registration data. Those recommendations resulted in ICANN conducting its first operational design assessment and proposing ultimately a system, what was at that time called a WHOIS disclosure system. After consultation with the board and the GNSO Council, as well as on the broader community, the board agreed that we would launch a system, what we ultimately called the RDRS, by late 2023. The system was developed to track usage and demand data for request submissions, as I mentioned earlier, and that data was meant to inform the board's ultimate consideration of those policy recommendations. So ultimately, we ended up launching on the 28th of November in 2023, and we launched with 56 registrars covering just over half of gTLD domains under management. Move to the next slide. There we go. So a little bit about where we went after we launched. So by March of 2024, we had delivered our first 6-month operational update and shared that a little bit later at ICANN 80 in Kigali. By August of 2024, we had implemented several enhancements that were based on the GNSO Standing Committee's feedback. This was a small group that we worked with who advised us on how we could improve the system from a user experience, both for requesters and for registrars. I was hoping that Seb Dukos, who chaired that group, and of course is based in the European region, might join. He might still be on, I'm not sure. And he can share a little bit more about that later on the call and the good work that group did and advised us on some good enhancements that we made. And I'll speak about those later in the presentation. So November of 2024, of course, was the 1-year anniversary of RDRS. We published an annual report, kind of a summary of operations from the first year in February of 2025. And by August of this year, so just a few months ago, the Standing Committee felt they had enough information to publish their findings report with several recommendations that were made to the GNSO Council. These were not policy recommendations, but recommendations for how the council should engage with the board and where they think the RDRS pilot ought to go next. So in the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit about some of those operational metrics I mentioned. So here are some big numbers, key numbers for us. User data, we had 13,000 as of October of 2025, I should say. That's the last comprehensive month we have data for. We had a little over 13,000 unique user accounts and 79 participating registrars. This covers just under half of the gTLD domains under management. And I'll talk in a moment about why that number has decreased since launch. We received 3,600 requests. 3,300 of those have been closed, which means a registrar has taken some sort of action on the request, whether approving, denying, partially approving, or we have the option to indicate that the information was publicly available. The service operates, the first step you do within the service is to look up a domain and see whether it's actually covered by the service. And we had close to 39,000 domain name searches within RDRS. About 9,000 of those actually resulted in lookups for non-participating registrars, indicating that the registrar for the domain isn't participating in RDRS. The rest, of course, were participating and were either ended up in submitted requests or were not. And I'll talk a little bit more about request approvals on a later slide. So we did quite a lot of engagement and outreach to encourage people to participate in the system. And interestingly, once the system launched, we began to see a ramp up in both the number of webinars to educate and a corresponding increase in the number of requesters who were participating in the service. So month over month, the number of requester counts has steadily risen, correlating at least in part to these events. Registrar participation did begin to decline in March of this year. And as I mentioned, in September, we hit 79 registrars. A little bit about why. We've spoken to a lot of registrars about this, and we're getting constant feedback. Some decided that once the Standing Committee began to draft its findings report for the GNSO Council, that group should have enough information from the activities that were underway in the pilot, and so didn't think they needed to participate in the pilot any further. Other registrars have told us that participating in RDRS is actually a bit of double work for them, so they are processing requests both within RDRS and also within their own system, so kind of a two-track. And they decided to withdraw just for efficiency's sake and requested that if we're going to continue to service, that we find ways to better integrate with their own existing systems. And that's something that the Standing Committee has also recommended to us. And the board has also asked that the org consider in the future. In the next few slides, we're going to talk a little bit more about, let's see, why is this not clicking? There we go, about some of the actual usage statistics. So here you're going to see the number of times a domain name was searched in RDRS and the search outcomes by percentage. So every query or every domain lookup within RDRS is categorized in a few ways. And I'm going to explain to you what each of these things mean. The domain not found, that means the domain does not exist in the system and is not registered. It does not exist in an RDRS. So this could be a totally bogus name or one that's never been registered at all. Domain not supported means the domain name is not in the official list of top-level domains or has come in an invalid format. So this could include ccTLDs, which are not supported by RDRS, as well as other TLDs like gov, mil, int, edu that also aren't a part of the pilot program. Registrar not supported means the registrar of record for the domain name is not participating in the RDRS pilot. As a reminder, the pilot is actually voluntary for all registrars. They're not required to participate in it. Domain is valid means the domain name is actually managed by an ICANN accredited registrar who's participating in the pilot. So this could be considered a successful lookup and one that could actually turn into a request. And then the last thing I'll note here is, as I mentioned before, the total number of valid searches does not equate the total number of requests that have been submitted. We found that a lot of folks have been using the service just out of curiosity to see what domains are in there, what they can look up. Is your own domain name covered, etc. So that gives you the why there's such a much higher number than there are requests. So this slide shows you where requests are coming from. And really what this means is that we're not validating these categories. In other words, we don't know whether, for example, these are the actual IP holders submitting requests. Rather, what it represents is the requester selecting a category from a drop-down list of what category they would choose for their specific request. So you could see the majority of requests have come from intellectual property holders, followed by the category other, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and then law enforcement. In the other category, we've dug deeper into what people have listed in an open text field. So there's a few things happening here. The biggest category and what we're finding that people are listing in other is brand protection vendors, or some variation of that is what folks are saying. So those may also be considered IP holders. We also see folks not using the pick list and retyping a request type that might actually have fit into one of these categories. And then the other one we've seen commonly is domain owners are utilizing the other category. To dig a little bit deeper into requests that are approved versus denied, as you can see, most requests have actually been denied. 29% of requests were approved, 61% denied. Registrars can select multiple denial reasons for each request, and they're required to report on why they are denying. So the most common reasons, as you can see here, is the contracted party cannot disclose information due to applicable law, or the request is incomplete, or they did not respond to requests for additional information. In the other category, again, that's been a common one. We've found that the most common reasons are that registrar is reporting some type of misuse of the service. So for example, requesting data related to a UDRP case, technical support for a domain name, compliance requests, data subject removal requests, etc. Now we're going to talk a little bit about jurisdiction and where the requests are coming from and where they're being processed. As you can see, the vast majority of requests are coming from the United States. And within that category, they're primarily, again, intellectual property holders, law enforcement, and consumer protection. About 6% of requests are coming from the United Kingdom, which is the second highest country or jurisdiction by volume of requests submitted. And again, it's similar categories, law enforcement, intellectual property, and other. The other top 10 countries, so the remaining 8 countries in the top 10 account for about 17% of all of the requests submitted since we began tracking this metric in June of 2024. That was actually at the request of the standing committee, and we've been reporting on that consistently since June of last year. So separate from where a requester lists their jurisdiction, we are also asking where requesters are processing the data for which that they are requesting access to. And again, here we see that the bulk of those disclosure requests claim to be processing the data in the United States at 60%. By contrast, and again, in parallel with the previous metric, 6% of requests have data processed in the United Kingdom, which again is the second highest country by volume. Go on more. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the feedback we've received from requesters and registrars. We conducted regular surveys of both types of users throughout the pilot. We also conducted interviews with users, and of course, we had the standing committee, and we received a lot of feedback from there. So we got a lot of positive feedback as well as some feedback on areas for improvement. So in terms of requesters, what we heard is they really liked the benefits of a centralized system and a standardized format. It makes the process faster and easier. In terms of improvements, they requested additional explanation for denials from registrars. So this was a big theme area. For example, which applicable laws in particular prevent them from disclosure? What provisions of RDRS legal terms have they failed to comply with? And or what other corrective action can be taken before a request can be processed? So really seeking more information from the registrars in those denials. The GNSO Standing Committee in their findings report also made a note of this and highlighted that as an area that we could work on in future iterations for a better user experience.
Eleeza, we have the question.
Please.
So it's from Maciek Piasecki. Do we have data on whether entities which were denied made a subsequent request? And maybe how it splits between groups, e.g. when law enforcement gets denied, they make a corrected request, but other groups do not continue to be denied.
Great question. We haven't tracked to that level of granularity. I will be honest, I am not the expert on statistics. I'm not sure if we can. I know that we don't have it available in the metrics, but I think that's an interesting point. We do have data on requesters. I think the important thing to know is we've tried to keep this as anonymous as possible, which means we're not really digging into the behavior of individual requesters, but more as a group.
Thank you.
Questions before I move on?
Not right now, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm flying through this because I realize we only have 30 minutes and I want to leave time for questions. So please do interrupt me if anything interests you here. So from registrars, we also got some positive feedback on streamlining and the centralization of requests. They noted that the service also reduced the number of requests that are missing information given the form and the information that's being required, and that the registrar response section itself is actually user-friendly and easy to navigate. On the other hand, we also got a lot of feedback from registrars, and we continue to on some of the challenges. So as I mentioned before, there's a need to integrate better with registrars' existing ticketing systems to avoid that double work. I mentioned the ability to improve bulk functionality, so the ability to respond to multiple requests at once, and a request for additional form questions and better questions for the requesters to get better information from requesters for registrars to process those requests. As well as registrars suggested we provide requesters with more guidance on what constitutes a quality request. So I think there you see a good complement to what requesters are seeking as well in terms of better information back from registrars on why certain things were denied. So in the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the enhancements that have completed. As I mentioned, since the launch, we have done quite a lot of work to improve the service, much of it at the request of the Standing Committee, which provided us with excellent feedback throughout the pilot. You see here all of them listed. I'll highlight a few of them. So one has been new messaging on the RDRS logging page and a link to RDRS on the ICANN lookup tool. That's lookup.icann.org, which directs folks to RDRS if they are interested in requesting non-public registration data. We updated language in the email that's sent to requesters once the registrar has concluded the review to highlight the survey and need for requester feedback. This resulted in some more surveys results, which gave us some good user data. We added the requester address, phone, and another optional field for organization and affiliation to the requester form. We heard from registrars that this was valuable for processing requests and understanding who is requesting the data. We also increased open text field character limits to allow for more space for requesters to make their case for the request. And on the registrar, we've made some changes to their user experience and viewing how they view the requests and how they view all of the requests that have come into a registrar. And then lastly, I think an interesting one to highlight, we heard from a lot of registrars that requests were incorrectly categorized. So a perfect example is a request might be categorized as law enforcement by a user, and the user themselves is not law enforcement, but the request itself is related perhaps to a law enforcement matter, and the registrars felt that wasn't represented by that category. So now registrars are able to review a request and then change that category to what they think is more appropriate. That also allows for better reporting from our side. As I mentioned, we work closely with the GNSO's RDRS Standing Committee, and I was hoping Seb, the chair, would be on, but I don't think I see him in the list. It's hard to look at multiple screens at once. The Standing Committee completed their work and recently also completed their consensus call and submitted their report to the GNSO Council, which I believe is going to talk about the report and possibly take action on it in December. So the standing committee's purpose was really to evaluate the RDRS over the 2-year pilot, keep an eye on the metrics, and ultimately make some recommendations to the GNSO Council. What I'm sharing here in front of you are some of the key improvements the committee or the council, I should say, had recommended, the committee, excuse me, not the GNSO Council. The standing committee is recommended to be considered by the board. We have a link to their full findings report in this slide. It's a very detailed report. It's excellent, and I would suggest you look at that. For many of these recommendations, further policy work is needed, so it'll be up to the GNSO Council to determine how to move forward on them. And I'll also add that a lot of these recommendations largely align with improvements that the board and the community has been discussing for 2 years, and in fact is something the board has asked the org and the council to think about as we move ahead with continuing to operate the RDRS. Let me move on. So what's next for RDRS? So as I mentioned, the RDRS pilot will continue. It's no longer a pilot. It's an operational service for up to 2 more years. The board requested that ICANN Board continue this until such time as we have a policy for a long-term solution. The ICANN will continue to work with an RDRS standing committee or some form of it if the council decides to continue that group as a consultative body for us. We anticipate that the council will make a decision on that in December. The standing committee themselves recommended that would be useful, and we'd certainly welcome their continued input. The community discussions on both RDRS and RDRS-related policy work are continuing. Some of the related work has to do with a timeline for urgent requests. That's an outstanding item from the EPDP Phase 1 work, as well as work on privacy proxy service implementation, and of course the consensus policy recommendations on an SSAD. The ICANN Board recently published an RDRS policy alignment analysis, which is actually open for public comment through December 9th. The board published this together with their resolution asking us to continue the RDRS for up to 2 more years. The intent there was to lay out a roadmap for how we could potentially align RDRS-related policies to facilitate system improvements together with some of these outstanding policy issues I mentioned to you. So the SSAD policy requirements, the urgent request timeline, and the privacy and proxy related recommendations. All of these are elements that the board, the community, and the standing committee themselves have recognized and called out as needing alignment. And that paper proposes a path forward for that. I'd really urge you to look at that. It's linked here in the presentation you can download. There is also an outstanding public comment on the urgent request timeline, which is somewhat related here, and I'd urge you to take a look at that as well. And then lastly, we're continuing work on law enforcement authentication. One of the standing committee's recommendations was to work on authentication, particularly starting with law enforcement, because that's such a key element, particularly for the urgent requests. For the board and council have agreed that for a timeline on urgent requests to be enforceable, we need a reliable authentication mechanism. ICANN Org is working with the GACS Public Safety Working Group and several members there to design something that might work and that we could potentially pilot with RDRS during this ongoing operational period. And we hope to have more to report on that soon. There's a community group that's been advising on that as well. And then lastly, because we're now just about concluded with the pilot, we intend to publish a pilot summary report sometime in Q1 of 2026. That'll provide an operational overview and assessment of the pilot over 2 years. And I think that is my last slide. Yep. So here you have some links for how to create an account, how to utilize the system, and of course some links for registrars. If we have any registrars here, we would be happy to take on board more registrars who'd like to join the service. It's fairly simple to enable that within NSP, and we'll continue to support it. So I've gone as quickly as I can, and we're already nearly at time, but I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes to answer any questions.
Thank you, Eleeza. And I think I found this really interesting, and I would really like to encourage everyone to ask you questions, the specialist here. So please either type your question in the Q&A pod or raise your hand. Whilst everyone is thinking of a good question, I do have a few actually. I must say, I think it's a little bit depressing to see that you actually have covering less percentage of domain names now than when you started. So that's depressing, of course. I still believe in the project, so I'm hoping everything will work out fine. I'm wondering, I saw that you said US and UK are actually submitting most requests. Is this because, is the system only in English?
Yes, great question. So, yes, the system is in fact in English. The questions and the form are all in English. And of course, English is the legal operating language of ICANN. There could be a lot of reasons why those are the two primary ones, but those have indeed been the largest source of requests.
Are there any plans for perhaps at least introducing the UN languages? Or you can see the top 10 countries there that were several that were non-UN languages. So just thinking of
So, no, not currently. No plans for that. I think so. A few things to think about. First of all, this is not yet a permanent system, right? We're continuing to operate on a temporary basis until we have clear requirements for something that would be a part of that would be required by consensus policy. So I think in that sense, we've tried to keep it relatively simple. But again, I think the other important point to note is English is the legal language that ICANN operates in, and a lot of these questions are legal questions that are within the service. And so depending on the registrar and the requester, it can get quite challenging. That being said, there is an opportunity to provide a lot of documentation and information within the service, within open text fields, to add attachments. So for example, to demonstrate trademark ownership and so forth. And those, of course, would be in whatever the legal language is for your country. So I think there's opportunity to add in more information that is appropriate for the jurisdiction you're coming from.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions? Because I have more, but I'll invite everyone else to post a question as well. A follow-up question on that is, do you have any measurement or statistics on how many, for instance, law enforcement agencies around the world that actually are aware of this? Because I think that might be an issue as well.
That's a great question. I don't have statistics on that to answer your question. We've done quite a lot of outreach, a number of webinars to larger law enforcement groups. We have engaged, again, as I mentioned, with the PSWG. The group that we're working with there, that work is really led by two members who come from the United States and from Interpol. Interpol, of course, has excellent reach around the globe, and we are actively working with them to find a way to not just reach out to their member states more, but also find a way to perhaps utilize Interpol as an identity provider for RDRS. And we are optimistic about how that might work out. Still very much in early stages of the discussion, but I think that is a really good way to do outreach more to relevant requesters, people who might be interested.
Okay. Do we have any questions? If not, I have a last question to you. But I just want to give everyone a chance to. I don't see any questions. So let me ask my last question here. And that is, do you think there is a chance or a risk, however you look at it, that this actually will become a compulsory service for gTLDs?
I think so. I think there seems to be an appetite within our community for policy that would make clear what the requirements are and have it be available and consistent. There seems to be a divide in the community on whether or not it should be required for registrars to participate. That's a discussion for the community to have, but it certainly is an ongoing discussion. And from what I understand, it will continue in policy conversations within the GNSO.
Okay. Again, last chance. Any questions? Please ask them now, or we will release Eleeza. I think that was it. Eleeza, thank you so much for being with us this early morning for you. I found this really interesting. Before I let everyone go, I just want to say this was, as I mentioned, the last webinar for this semester, but we will be back end of January. It looks like right now that we will look into DNS abuse mitigation plans for the future, but I'll be back with more information about that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Eleeza, once again, and I hope to see you in January. Thank you, Sadly.
Thanks for your good questions. Bye-bye.
Thanks.